Good evening, YouTube. Welcome back to the channel. This is IMAX Sports North Football video, and today I'm going over my Week 7 power rankings for the 2023 NFL season. Sorry I'm doing this video a little bit later today. I was just really invested in the Giants game. I was hoping that they were going to win, but sadly they did not. So let's get right into it. First off, we have tragic. This category has been the same three teams for the last 3 weeks, and it will continue to be the same three teams until one of them gets a win. We have the Panthers at 32, we have the Broncos at 31, and the Patriots at 30. The Panthers are 0-6. The Broncos are 1-5. Their only win is against the Bears, and the Patriots are 1-5. Yeah, not much to be said there. The Patriots almost beat the Raiders this week. If they had done that, they probably still would be in this category because I don't think that the Raiders are a very good team. Even though they're 3-3, they don't feel like a 3-3 team. But hey, they're doing better than the Patriots. So, yeah, none of these teams are going to be doing anything this season. Moving on to the dumpster fire, we have the Bears, the Cardinals, and the Giants. The Giants may or may not have been in this category, but I kept them in here simply because they just couldn't close out the game. I put them above the Cardinals, and I really just don't think that they're on the same level as the teams in the tier above them. They played a phenomenal game defensively against the Bills this week. And I'm very excited to see Tyrod Taylor playing, even though it's too bad Daniel Jones is injured. But I just can't put them in a category with the teams above them. So right now they're still in the dumpster fire. If they had won this game, they would have been moved up to the next category, but sadly they weren't able to clinch it. If they had kicked the field goal or gotten a touchdown at the end of the half, it may have been different, but they couldn't do it. The Bears, their only win was against Washington last week. It was a fairly impressive 20-point win, but other than that, they have had a terrible season. And then the Cardinals beat the Giants, and that's their only win of the season. No, sorry, they lost to the Giants. It was the Giants' only win. Their win was against the Cowboys, but other than that, they've had a terrible year. Moving on, we have some glimpse of hope. We have the Titans at 26, the Packers at 25, the Vikings at 24, the Raiders at 23, and the Falcons at 22. I'd say that this is like split into the Titans and Packers, and then the Raiders and the Falcons, and then the Vikings are somewhere in the middle. The Titans and Packers both started off fairly strong. The Titans were 2-2, and they looked okay. They had won some games, and they lost some. They had a big blowout against the Bengals, and then they got blown out by the Browns. But the last couple of weeks, they've lost 2 games in a row to pretty good teams. And they're just kind of sitting at like below average, but they can win sometimes. And then with the Packers started off really strong. A lot of people thought they're going to be good. They were 2-1. Now they're 2-3, and Jordan Love has looked terrible in his last 2 starts. The Packers have only beaten 2 teams so far, and they've beaten the Bears and another team that I forget off the top of my head, but they weren't great either. Oh, the Saints. They beat the Bears and the Saints. They beat the Saints by 1 in a weird game, and the Bears just I don't even know if they count this year as a win. So, yeah, the Packers really haven't looked impressive, and then they lost to the Raiders. The Raiders I really thought were not a good team until they beat the Packers, and then I gave the Raiders a little bit more respect. So, the Packers have lost to both the Raiders and the Falcons. I think that the Packers have more potential than the Raiders and the Falcons do, but because they've lost to both of them, I have to put them lower. As for the Vikings, they are 2-4. Their 4 losses are probably 4 of the toughest teams in the league. Tampa hasn't looked as good over the last couple of weeks, so that loss hasn't aged as well as the other ones. But the Chargers, the Eagles, and the Dolphins are 3 of the better teams in the league. So the Vikings' losses are pretty tough losses, and they've won the games they're supposed to. As for the Raiders and the Falcons, they've had reverse trajectories. The Raiders started off bad, the Falcons started off good. They both had okay middles, and then the Falcons have come back a little bit recently, and the Raiders have pulled it in to start gaining some momentum. They're both 3-3. They both look okay. The Falcons have been more consistent this season, so they're higher. But the Raiders have not been terrible recently. Moving on, they're still confused. We got Washington, the Saints, and the Colts. I had a category. I've had this confused category of teams that really want to be good, really will play good, and then they'll just have some terrible games. The Colts are 3-3. Two of those losses have both come to Jacksonville, which is very odd. They've actually played really well in all of their games. They beat the Ravens. They've had some good wins, but the Colts ultimately have been a very mid team. They just don't look very promising. And also Anthony Richardson's injured. They've had a lot of injuries. They've had a lot of issues. Their offense looks good when they're healthy, but they just don't look. The last couple of weeks haven't been this week hasn't been the best. So I'm just a little confused about where the Colts are right now. The Saints started off very strong, and then they've lost a couple games in a row. This week particular was not a great game. They beat the Patriots by 34, but that's really not that impressive considering how we've been playing recently. And so the loss this week and then the loss before the Patriots week for the Saints really weren't great games for them. As for Washington at 21, Washington started off 2-0, then they lost 3 games in a row, and then they've won 1 recently. They lost to the Eagles by 3, which was a pretty decent game, and then they lost to the Bears by 20. And then this week they beat the Falcons. So I don't really know where to put Washington. I think that 21 is a pretty fair spot. They don't have any super impressive wins, and their losses are pretty expected losses. So they're just kind of... There's a lot of teams that are 3-3, and Washington had a better start than they've been playing recently, so they're down a little bit. Moving on, we have teams that are still interesting. We have Tampa at 18, we have the Steelers at 17, and we have the Texans at 16. The Steelers are 3-2. They're on bye this week. The Buccaneers are 3-3, and the Texans are 3-3. The Texans and the Buccaneers both started off pretty strong. The Texans were 1-2, and then they got to 3-2, and now they're 3-3. The Buccaneers started 2-0, and now they've regressed back to 3-3. They've lost most of their games to pretty good teams. They beat the Vikings, which was probably their most impressive win so far. Well, they had another impressive game too, but their wins haven't been the best wins in the world. And they've been pretty okay. They've been good on offense and they've been okay on defense. But they started off better and then they've just kind of regressed. So they're down a little bit for now, but they may come back up later. The Steelers are in a weird position because they've won both of their divisional games against the Browns and the Ravens, who are pretty strong teams this year. But they just really haven't looked good in any of the other games. Just those 2 games. Those are the only 2 games they looked good in. They beat the Raiders, but again, that game doesn't really count. And then their losses were all horrendous blowouts. Some of them were against good teams, but one of their losses was a 30-6 loss to Houston. Houston has been super up and down. They'll either win by 1,000,000 points or lose by 1,000,000 points, and there's not really much in between. They beat the Saints this week, which was a pretty okay game for them. And then they demolished the Steelers a couple weeks ago. But yeah, Houston's been super up and down in the power rankings, so I think that 16 is probably perfect for them right now. Next up, we have probably contenders. We have the Chargers, the Rams, the Browns, and the Jets. The Jets and the Browns both shot up this week. The Jets way more than the Browns. For the most part, I've been majorly copiuming the Jets. I've had them pretty low for the most part, saying that the Week 1 win against Buffalo was a fluke. And then once they lost to us, I was like, okay, the Jets are terrible. And then they played well against Kansas City, and I was like, okay, they played a good game. And then they beat the Broncos, and I was like, okay, that was expected. And then this week, they beat the Eagles. And so now they're 3-3. They've had one of the hardest schedules so far to play this year. Obviously, they've played the Patriots and the Broncos, so those 2 games aren't tough. But their other games are pretty tough. They played Dallas, the Eagles, the Chiefs, and the Bills. So they've had one of the hardest schedules in the league so far. They're 3-3, and they've beaten one of the better teams in the league. I have them at 12 right now. I think that that's too high. But that's just based on how they've played. So, yeah, we'll see. The Browns are at 13 because Deshaun Watson is still injured. Once Deshaun Watson comes back, they'll bump up. But they beat the 49ers without him. P.J. Walker beat the 49ers. So, yeah, 2 wild games from the Jets and the Browns. I have the Jets higher than the Browns simply because the Jets have their starting quarterback in right now. and their defense is just a little bit more consistent. As for the LA teams, the Chargers and the Rams, the Chargers are 2-2. The Rams are 3-3. The Rams have been up and down similarly to Houston so far this season. I think that they're going to be a pretty decent contender this year, but they just need to get a little bit more consistency down. As for the Chargers, they've done pretty much what I've expected them to do this season. They've beaten the two teams they're supposed to. They've lost the two games they're supposed to lose. If they beat the Cowboys tomorrow, they'll probably move up back to 12 where they belong. If they lose to the Cowboys, they'll probably stay at 15. I don't really see them moving much based on tomorrow's result. The Cowboys aren't that much better than them, so if they beat them, then I'll probably move them up to around 12. But yeah. Moving on, we have the strong contenders. We have the Bengals at 11, we have the Seahawks at 10, we have the Ravens at 9, and we have the Cowboys at 8. There were two teams that moved a lot of places in the power rankings this week. They were the Jets and the Bengals. The Bengals moved less places than the Jets did, but they moved up to 11 after, like, you wouldn't expect them to move up to 11 after the week that they had, but it's just because, like, the Seahawks are a strong team, but you wouldn't expect them to move up 7 or 8 spots just from one win. But the thing is that they've looked good the last 4 weeks. They had one bad game in the middle there, but they looked good against the Ravens. They won last week. They won this week. They beat Seattle, which is a good team, and they're looking like the Bengals. Joe Burrow's looking like Joe Burrow. Jamar Chase is looking like Jamar Chase. They look like the Bengals. So they're 3-3, but so are the rest of the teams ranked between 23 and 12. So there's like 15 teams that are 3-3. So although they are 3-3, I'm having them at 11 just because they've looked like the Bengals the last couple of weeks, and none of the other 3-3 teams have really looked super impressive the last few weeks. Seattle's at 10. They did lose to the Bengals this week, but I do think that they have been a more consistent team so far this year. If the Bengals continue to do well, they'll move above Seattle, but for right now I'm having Seattle higher simply because they've been a more consistent team, and so far the way that they've played, they deserve to be in the top 10. The Bengals don't deserve to be in the top 10 based on how their season's gone so far, but once they play a couple more good games, then they'll move up to the top 10. The Ravens are at 9. They won a game they're supposed to win this week after a bad game last week. So they bounced back. They're back into the top 10, mostly because other teams that were above them lost. And yeah, it was a pretty decent week for the Ravens. The Cowboys are at 8. They actually lost a couple of places from last week. They haven't played yet, but just because I was reevaluating all the teams after week 6, because week 6 is one of those weeks where you start seeing where the teams are falling into place. I just reevaluated the Cowboys. I also hadn't watched the entirety of the Cowboys-49ers game, and this game was horrendous. If they beat the Chargers, I don't really expect my opinion on them to change much, because the Jaguars and the Dolphins both have been improving, and the Cowboys have been getting worse. So because of that, I don't really expect the Cowboys to be moving up just for beating the Chargers. The Dolphins have already done that this year. So they'll probably stay at 8 even if they win or lose because they are better than the other teams in their category. Moving on to Elite Junior. We have the Bills at 7, we have the Jaguars at 6, and we have the Dolphins at 5. I had Buffalo last week at number 4, I believe, above Dallas. I've moved them down to 7 in their win against the Giants, simply because this is their second week in a row looking not great. They lost to the Jaguars in a very low-scoring game. They were playing catch-up the entire game. They lost 25-20. And then this week, they lost to the Giants. It was an away game, but like they're in the same state. They're gonna have a lot of Bills fans there. They're used to the cold. It was only 48, so it wasn't even that cold. But they just did not play a good game. The Giants are not a very good team, and they looked good defensively this week. The Bills have been the most inconsistent team in the league this year, in my opinion. They lost to the Jets, and then they played 3 phenomenal games in a row, winning by 30 in all of them, including beating the Dolphins. And then they lose to the Jaguars, and then they almost lose to the Giants. They have been the most inconsistent team in the league this year, and until they get some consistency, they're going to be out of the top 5. The Jaguars are at 6. They've also been inconsistent, but they're on an upswing, whereas the Bills are on a downswing. The Jaguars beat the Bills, and they've improved from 1-2 to 2-4, so they've won to 4-2, so they've won 3 games in a row. Buffalo has fallen from 3-1 to 4-2, so they've lost a game. The Jaguars are looking better currently than the Bills are. And then Miami is just the most consistent team out of these three. The Bills did demolish them, but the Jaguars also beat the Bills, so you can't really win with any combination here. I just think that Miami's been the most consistent team so far out of these three, and they are also 5-1. Last but not least, we have the NFL's elite. We have the 49ers at 1, we have the Lions at 2, we have the Chiefs at 3, and we have the Eagles at 4. The 49ers and the Eagles both lost surprising games this week to the Jets and the Browns. They've been 1-2 in basically all of the power rankings this year, except for that 1 week where I had the Dolphins at 1. But the 49ers and the Eagles have been the perennial 1-2. The Eagles have fallen to 4 after that loss because they really haven't had any impressive games. None of their games have really been that good this year. And so they beat the Chargers and they beat the Vikings. No, they didn't play the Chargers. They beat the Vikings. They haven't had that impressive of a season so far this year. And then losing this week to the Jets was a pretty bad game. The Chiefs are also 5-1. Their loss was to the Lions, so they lost to a more impressive team. And they lost with some starters out. They lost with Travis Kelce and Chris Jones out week 1. So the Chiefs have only lost 1 game, and they lost by 1 point. I'd say that they've had a more consistent season than the Eagles have, although neither of them have had super hard schedules. The 49ers have been the best team in the league the whole season. They did lose to the Browns this week against their backup quarterback, but I just think it was a kind of a fluke game for them. For the most part, they just didn't look very good. So next week, we'll see if they look a little bit better. But the 49ers just have been the most consistent team this year. And then the Lions at 2. The Lions have been one of my favorite teams the last couple of years. Amon-Ra St. Brown is a big fantasy guy for me. And they've just looked phenomenal this year. Their only losses to Seattle, they lost by 6, losing 37-31. But the other games this season, their defense has gotten better every single week. The last couple of years, their defense has been the issue, especially last year. When their offense was good, their defense was horrendous. It was the worst defense in the league for the first half of the season. But their good defense from last year at the end of the year has carried over to this year. And outside of the Seahawks game, their defense has played very well. This week, the regular game against the Panthers, they won 42-20-something. So, not the most impressive game in the world, but a lot of other teams have dropped. And the Lions beat Kansas City week 1, so they have the tiebreaker. Since I now kind of see all of these teams around the same level. So, thank you guys for watching. I hope you guys enjoy. Make sure to leave a like. Subscribe to the channel if you are new, and I'll see you guys on the next one. Peace.